All right, we are live. Thank you so much to our panelists for joining. We'll give it a minute or two as people kind of start rolling in here. We've got a really awesome topic today that I think is often not fully appreciated by everyone in the sector, and more broadly, what advocacy means to nonprofits. So I'm really excited to dig in with the experts that we have here on the panel. For background, my name is Mitch Stein. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Pond. We host these conversations every Thursday at noon that you can come find us. And when you join, you start building up credits on the platform to spend on anything your organization needs. So you can actually scan this QR code right on your computer screen and check out Pond yourself. And we would love to share more about how we can help meet the biggest needs of your nonprofit today. So it's totally free to join, and you'll get rewards every step of the way for using it. But this is not about Pond today. This is about the amazing experts we have here. And I wanted to kick off by just doing some quick intros before we get into the meat of the conversation. If we'll go around, if everyone doesn't mind sharing who you are, what your role is, and a few layers of your identity that are most important to you in this conversation today. And we'll kick off with Glenda.
Darn you, Mitch.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. You had to start with someone. I was thinking to myself, I was like, this is just like the podcast. I should be ready for this. My name is Glenda Testone. I am the executive director, CEO of the Lesbian, Gay, Bisexual, and Transgender Community Center in New York City. And I am queer. I am married to a trans non-binary person. I am a mom. I have a 3.5-year-old. I am a lover of true crime podcasts. Like took a real left turn there. And I am a lover of advocacy and social justice and equity, and just really happy to be here and have this conversation.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Glenda. Denise, do you want to go next?
Sure. So my name is Denise Brogan-Cater. Right now, I am newly retired, but I spent the last 25 years of my career in LGBTQ plus advocacy. I'm a former executive director of a statewide organization, Equality Michigan. In fact, I was the first openly trans executive director of an LGBTQ statewide organization in the country. I most recently was the chief policy officer and CEO at Family Equality. Though I should say interim CEO, because I was only there. I only wanted the job in the last year that I was there to find a new CEO, and we did. And her name is Stacey Stevenson. She's a remarkable, amazing advocate, and I'm thrilled that she's leading that organization that I love so much. I was there about 10 years. They hired me actually to start advocacy in the States. And so I built a state advocacy organization from the ground up at Family Equality. So that's pretty much what I've been doing. I'm a grandparent. I have 2 grandbabies, 3 grown daughters, a wife, a 97-year-old mother-in-law that lives with me, and 4 cats.
Love it. Thank you so much, Denise. And Emily, you want to wrap it up for us?
Sure. Thank you for having me, Mitch, and Glenda and Denise, my fellow panelists, who are exceedingly more qualified than I am. So grateful to be amongst such an incredible group. And I think also important to recognize my privilege as a straight white woman, but grateful to be here nevertheless. I work for a company called Every Action with our sister organization, NGP Van, and we provide tools to nonprofits to help increase fundraising and outreach advocacy. I work more specifically with groups in the social movement and advocacy space. And I'm really grateful that I've been able to make a career of being an advocate. This is something that I got into in college. It was a passion of mine. I think one of the things that I'm sure we'll talk about today is how you can really leverage those folks who maybe are extremely passionate about advocacy, but don't necessarily know how to become involved. So really lucky that I get to now advise nonprofits on how to engage those folks.
Amazing. Well, I am so excited to dig into this. You all have amazing perspectives from a lot of different sides of this topic. I will just say to the audience, you absolutely can ask any question you want in the comments. We'll try to get to any and all of them, and don't miss your chance to get your questions heard here with these experts. I'd love to just start off at a bit of like definitional level, because sometimes I use the expression capital A advocacy to differentiate from like everyday advocacy. And I think that's a distinction not everyone fully understands. Glenda, could you explain or share how you think about capital A advocacy as a program of what you do at the center being different than you advocate for the LGBT community all the time and everything you do? How is that program specifically different?
It's a really great question. I was initially gonna, in leading into this conversation, I was thinking about advocacy, and I relate to Emily in saying I feel really lucky to have a paid gig as an advocate, and have for the last 20 something plus years. Not something they really teach you in school. It's sort of something I discovered, and I have a master's degree in women's studies. And I think when I realized like, oh, there's a nonprofit, like, I can be, what's an executive director? What is that? Anyway, you could do it too, but you all know that you're already on this webinar. For us, advocacy, I really believe that advocacy doesn't need to be complicated. And it is something that people do naturally, and that people can sort of turn up or turn down on an individual, personal, just live in your life kind of way. So I really try to talk to people and say, you're probably already doing advocacy and you don't even realize. And I would say that's true of a lot of nonprofits that are service providers that may be like, oh no, we don't do advocacy, we just provide services. So the center is a service provider, and we provide a lot of basic services for our community: mental health, substance abuse, coming out, building families, all of that. But we also do advocacy. And I would say there's almost a false distinction between the two. Some of the best advocacy we do is through those folks that are providing services. And some of the best advocates are the folks receiving services. So to answer I don't want to go against your definition, Mitch. We do have a capital A advocacy program where we try to engage members of our community to specifically advocate for pieces of legislation, for changes to policies, for visibility in particular ways for our community. But I, as much as possible, try and not separate them, because I think there's a lot of powerful. I was working at advocacy organization, national nonprofits, GLAAD, and the women's media centers, and those were capital A advocacy organizations. They didn't provide services. And when I came to the center, I think a lot of people said that service providers don't do advocacy. And that has not been my experience. I just see a lot of people that are advocating every day, really trying to make a change in the world while they're supporting people right where they're at with the resources they have. And we happen to, and always have, sort of had an official advocacy capital A program. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, I think that's helpful. And Denise, I know you've been in a number of organizations in this space too. What is the goal of advocacy? If an organization is saying we want to spend more time on our advocacy initiatives, what is the goal of that kind of work in your mind?
Well, I'll try to answer that question. I think it's going to vary by agency, by organization, by overarching goal of a particular agency's mission. But at the end of the day, I mean, so to move away from big A to just lowercase a, advocacy is nothing more than just trying to get somebody to do something, or to agree with a position, or to allocate resources, fundraising, et cetera. It's any of those types of things. And so when you transfer that particular type of advocacy into big A advocacy, which I like. In my mind, I've always sort of thought of it as targeted advocacy, but I like the big A bit. When you try to transfer it over into the big A advocacy, then I think that its goal is very largely to affect change at some level. And from my perspective, and the work that I've done in my career, I'm an attorney. In fact, that's one of the reasons I went to law school, was to become an advocate for the LGBTQ queer community. And when you become, sorry, I lost my train of thought when I went down to the attorney thing. So when you start advocating for an organization, you're really trying to just affect change, right? So you want some change to take place, and it can be at the local level, like in Equality Michigan, we very often advocated for the passage of ordinances that just applied to the city right there. Just so if you live in this city, you have to you cannot discriminate against queer families. If all the way up to the state level, and advocating at the state legislature, up to the national level, that advocating for change that will impact the lives of everybody in the country. So it really just depends, I think, when you say what's the goal of advocacy, in my opinion, it is to affect change. And the question then becomes what kind of change, and that depends on the organization.
Yeah, it's like change. Yeah, but it sounds like, Denise, to me, what you're saying and how it's resonating with me is it's change that is kind of beyond your control, right? So you rely on a bigger party changing something. It's not just work you can do within your own organization. There's a piece of legislation that needs to change, or a policy that needs to change, and that's where advocacy comes in.
Yes. Yeah. Obviously, if you could implement the change yourself, you wouldn't need to advocate for it.
Yeah. And Emily, when you've seen people adopting technology around these initiatives, and people are getting started, what is that conversation typically like when they're making that decision to more intentionally build advocacy programs? Why are people typically starting that, and what works best when you're getting it off the ground?
I think, and this goes back to the sort of big A, smaller A conversation, right? Is you can advocate for anything. I can advocate for more coffee in the morning, or I can advocate to make sure that I have access to the reproductive health care that I deserve. And I know that we'll talk in a little bit about sort of like the difference between political activism and non-political activism. Ultimately, nonprofits are striving to enact change. And so some of the tools that we provide will give them access to engage with their supporters, whether that's, reaching out to those supporters to sign a petition, or whether that is enabling supporters to reach out to their elected officials. Ultimately, the goal remains education. I think that's the first step of advocacy, is always going to be education. The second step is going to be activation. How can you activate, your supporters? And the third, unfortunately, whether we are willing to admit it, is implementation. And that implementation is at the political level. So we enable our clients to educate, and then we enable our clients to activate. And both of those hopefully would lead to implementation.
Yeah, I love that breakdown too, because it always helps when something seems like a big, overwhelming task to get started, and breaking it down into those chunks. Yeah, I love that breakdown too, because it always helps when something seems like a big, overwhelming task to get started. And Glenda, I would love to hear from you as well. I know Emily brought up the political element, and sometimes I think people think, oh, nonprofits, they're not supposed to be political. How are they involved in politics? And there is a bit of a gray area when you're pushing for legislation and making it nonpartisan. Like, how do you think about navigating that as an organization, when sometimes the causes you are fighting for can fall along party lines?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And Denise or Emily, feel free to jump in. So my experience is exclusively with C3 nonprofits. And what that means, that is an official federal designation that essentially says we are a nonprofit that is not partisan. Like we're not we don't endorse certain candidates. We're not part of a political action committee. However, and this is where I think a lot of nonprofit folks get too cautious, we can absolutely advocate. We could advocate politically. If there is a piece of legislation out there, a policy, we can absolutely say this is right and this is what we want and this is not. It's a very, when you really drill down into the guidelines of what you can and cannot do, and this is where I say Denise and Emily would be helpful, because there is a different designation that is a C4 where you can go so far as to say, look, this candidate supports this thing that we think is really good, and this candidate doesn't, and so we think you should support this candidate over here.
So yeah, I will just jump in right there. I think that the distinction that maybe you're trying to draw is between a political action committee and a C4. A C4 can, in fact, advocate for legislation. It can go in and say, this piece of legislation is the right thing. And a C3 can do that only to the extent that it fits within certain IRS guidelines. Yes. But a C4, that's what a C4 does. But a C4 cannot recommend you vote for this person or that person. Only a political action committee can do that.
Oh, that's helpful. Thank you, Denise.
One thing I think is worth noting is that the term political has gotten so polarized in this country, as we live in a red versus blue and a me versus you. Do you want that pothole on your street to be fixed? That's political. It doesn't just come down to, do you think that your, gay best friend should be able to get married, which, absolutely should. Things like abortion that are so polarizing. I think it's important to make the distinction between, like, pretty much everything is political.
That's great, Emily. I literally had that in my mind as well when I first saw this question, was that, every time you have two or more people together and they're negotiating between themselves to try to accomplish something, whatever that is, that's politics. That's political. And so interaction with humans is necessarily political. And if we can draw back away from that label in a way that has almost become pejorative, I think we'll be much better off if we recognize that just simply trying to get something done with another human being is political. Then we won't be afraid to engage in political activism.
I would, since this is a Pride podcast, I would sort of liken it to the way that the word family has been sort of weaponized or tried to be weaponized in our, I know you know what I'm talking about, is where, my entire career has been in the LGBT space. So I remember coming into the space and being like, but we don't care. What? I have a family. There's a way in which I think the word political has, to Emily's point, really become like, oh, that's bad. We don't want to go there. Oh, we're just a nonprofit providing services. We're just trying to help people get food or housing or whatever. We don't want to be political. Everything is political. There is no sideline. There is no neutrality. And you either, part of the solution, part of the problem.
100%.
Sit back and sort of observe. That's just not the country or not the moment that we live in.
Yeah, and I thank you for clearing up maybe some common misunderstandings and establishing some of those things. I think it's really helpful to getting to, okay, now I'm with you. We're not political, we're advocating. And kind of best practices you've seen when, you are trying to make real change at a legislative level. What are the tools in the tool belt that work best, or things that you've seen be most effective in enacting that change? And if there's examples that come to mind, I'd be great context. I'm sure everyone has good answers to that. So Denise, I don't know if you want to go first.
Sure. Boy, I have so many examples and ideas that it's hard to pare them down. I think probably one of the things that I would start off with is the recognition that when you're talking about advocating for important change at a legislative or congressional level, in other words, at the state level or at the federal level, you very often are talking about a long game. You're not talking about, I'm going to go in there and I'm going to explain to my legislator or my representative or my senator that I need this and it's just going to happen, because that just isn't the way it works. And if you're prepared for the long game and you're prepared for the idea that things aren't going to happen in the time frame that you'd love for them to happen, you can start to map out a plan for how you're going to make it happen. And I'll give you an example. In the state of New York, for many years, like back from the days of Baby M, they had outlawed surrogacy. And surrogacy was actually a crime in the state of New York. And it was one of only 3 states in the nation that disallowed surrogacy in any form. And family equality, LGBTQ people form their families in a whole bunch of ways. One of the most common ways is coming from an opposite sex, heterosexual, if you will, family structure, and bringing kids with you into a same-sex relationship. But adoption, foster care, and surrogacy are also other ways that we form our families. And so we wanted to see this law changed in New York for LGBTQ people and the rest of the public in the state of New York. And so we started advocating. And for 8 years, I was on a campaign which we led, at least in the last 2 years we led, but that started off with writing the law. What do we want the law to look like? So legislators, congressional people usually don't write the laws that you see. Usually it's advocates. So we wrote the law. We formed a coalition of people we identified who are the stakeholders of the people we need to vote for us. It's sort of like the circles of influence, they call it. Where do I know that a particular legislator gets his information? Let me go talk to that person. And who are the constituencies that care about this bill? Let's bring them in together so that they can do their own advocacy. Sometimes advocacy is just a person going into an office and saying, listen, this is my family's story. This is why this is important to me. And persuading that legislator to understand it. And then ultimately, the cards have to be aligned. And in New York, we couldn't get it done despite all of those great things, despite it being just the right thing to do, because we couldn't get it past the Senate. And then a couple of years ago, the Senate shifted, and we had a blue Senate, a blue assembly, and a blue governor, and we got it done. So sometimes it just is persistence.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a great, you got to be in it for the long haul, and I think that's the case with so many, just about every nonprofit. If it was a quick fix thing, you probably wouldn't have an organization set up around it. It's just an important reminder.
And
also, I would just, sorry. Oh, no, go ahead, Denise.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one more thing. So there are so many other tools. I just said one thing, persistence. There are all of the, Emily's going to talk to you about actual tools that are useful. We used them, right? How do you figure out who wants to talk to which legislator? That's important. Nobody cares if I go in and talk to the representative from New York because I live in Florida. They don't give a crap what I have to say. There's op-eds, there's public opinion, and ultimately the goal of advocacy is to bring everybody along, right? So it becomes this groundswell, and no organization, no community has had greater success in this than the LGBTQ community in the last 25 years. It's been historic and phenomenal what we've been able to do by virtue of bringing the public along with us.
Yeah, I told you Denise and Glenda are far more qualified than I am, and I think these more specific historic examples of the effect that advocacy can have are extremely important. I also think that if we zoom back out to that education piece that we talked about earlier, right? Like what Denise is talking about is implementation born of activation. I think there was some study done in the by whom is escaping me, but 97% of advocacy efforts have, I believe it's like some, if not a lot, of impact on elected officials, but which elected officials? And we have power over who is in office. And I think that zooms back out to educating, people who are far less educated than the four of us on that first piece, which is obviously voting. And so I think advocacy extends to so much more than just impacting congressional opinions. And that's obviously getting those folks into place.
Yeah. Glenda, what did you find? Because I'm sure, like you said, there's a lot of things that go into it. And I'm sure there's been some huge legislative wins that the center has been a part of at the state level. Do you recall some tactics that maybe didn't work as well, or things that like really ended up moving the needle as you were playing around with that toolkit about what really pushed it forward in terms of your strategy?
It's a great question. We have been able to, I mean, exactly what Denise was describing. We absolutely experienced that in New York. A lot of things that we were pushing for a very long time that were going nowhere until we sort of had the circumstances aligned to be able to pass these things, like GENDA, the Gender Recognition Act. We really, but it's one of those things like hurry up and wait. Like we just worked so hard and then we're able to get those things across the finish line. I do think that what has worked well for us is when we have been able to leverage tools to be really targeted. It's accurate that like, even in a state, New York in this case, if I live in a particular county, folks representing a different county don't necessarily want to hear from me. My voice is not as important. And so knowing who's living where and who is in our database that could contact their legislature to advocate for this thing is no small feat. And I've seen tools advance over the years to be able to target that to the point where one of the coolest things I've seen recently is being able to text people. We all text so much right now. I can remember 20 years ago making phone calls, sending actual letters to people to try and communicate. And now our advocacy team has regular text banks where they have phone numbers of people that they can actually reach out to and say, hey, do you know that today is election day? What's your plan to go to the polls? And things like this. I think we've started to hear about this probably in the Obama era. But it reminds me of something that a mentor of mine used to say back when, and I think still holds true today, which is that politicians don't lead, they follow. And they follow the people if they're doing it well. And so if you find that politician, that elected officials, people, and get those people to advocate with that person, because we are talking about like human beings, individuals, that can be incredibly effective, much more effective than getting like a nationwide. I would say, we do a lot of petitions. And they're useful. They're useful in that like they show you the total number, but the more targeted, like, no, we've got 20 people in your district who really care about this issue and think this policy needs to change. That's going to have much more impact, much more quickly.
Can I also just mention that when we start talking about tools, sometimes you're talking about software, and sometimes that software is very expensive. And if you're a small nonprofit, investigate whether or not there is an ability to have a number of you, like 3 or 4 small nonprofits, join together and share a subscription. We found that very useful at Family Equality, where we were able to use some of this software that targets specific legislators with the constituents that live in their districts, and being able to send them and being able to target both the constituents and the legislators specifically with messages.
Love that. That's an awesome tip. Thank you, Denise. And on this topic of the tools, the literal technology, Emily, I'd love to hear how you've seen when an organization adopts a new piece of software. How have you seen that change the actual efforts that they're making as you work with them in that process?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, and obviously, that I refuse to use this platform as a plug for our tools, but that this is what our tools are designed to do. To increase fundraising, outreach, advocacy efforts. Very often, organizations who are stuck with the tools that they have, usually that's born, as Denise just mentioned, of budget. If everybody could put into place the best tools on the market for free, they would. But typically that's because they're allocating funding to their hardworking staff. They're allocating funding to running the types of events that are going to fund their mission and continue to increase those efforts. When we can get tools in place, and I think that starts on our side with educating organizations to understand that there's a cost associated with technology. That's just true not only in the nonprofit space, but in our homes and in our daily lives. But what does that cost, that investment mean? That really means that you're investing in, most of the time, efficiency, because organizations are piecemealing together solutions that they need to accept contributions, that they need to send emails to their supporters. Most of the time, what I've seen working with organizations who are able to implement these tools is a pretty quick uptick in fundraising. Then they can hire another staff member. When they can hire another staff member, they free up time in the existing team to increase other initiatives. Maybe they've never been able to source volunteers. Once they can source volunteers, they can offload some of those tasks to the volunteers. And from there, we free up time for the team members to start exploring things like applying for grants or going after those major donors. So it's an investment, but just like any investment, those investments yield positive results.
So I just want to lift everything Emily just said up again, because it was right on. But I also would add that just one piece of data, I'm sorry, I just don't have it off the top of my head, but there was a study done that when people engage in advocacy on behalf of an organization, they donate, they contribute funds to the organization like an orders of magnitude above what a non-engaged person is. So actually having an advocacy program and actually helping them to get engaged and help them to advocate on behalf of the mission that they care about, you're likely to increase your fundraising enough to actually pay for the tool.
Exactly. And I think that's something to keep in mind is typically your donors are your advocates and your advocates are your donors. We have a tool called Mobilize that I'm sure everyone's familiar with that allows you to quite literally mobilize not only your existing supporter base, but reach out to folks who might not yet be in your network. And the Biden campaign was able to raise multiple millions in a very short amount of time from just engaging those folks who wanted to show up to phone banks and show up to events. And then they were willing to donate $5 once they'd done that. So that's an excellent point.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead, Mitch.
No, please. I was going to ask you your thoughts, so please go.
So I was going to, just a different slice of the apple, so to speak, agree with everything Emily and Denise said. I have also seen, I think there is a false distinction sometimes between advocates or community members and donors. It's like, this is all the same group of people. And the example I was going to give, when we launched our most recent incarnation of our advocacy program, which is called Rise Out, we had sort of 4 pillars of work that we wanted to do. And we launched the first one immediately, and second and third one the next year. And then the fourth one, we didn't necessarily have funding for. And so we were kind of, and that pillar was around innovation and really sort of figuring out a way to support the next generation of advocates in our community. We had sort of thought out what this program could be, but we hadn't raised the money to do it. because we were engaging people and doing all of the other advocacy, the education, civic engagement, policy, we were able to connect with a couple of our donors who said, I want to give to the center. I really want to make a difference around this advocacy. I'm not sure what to do. And we were able to go to them and say, we have this fellowship program where we would love to. A lot of full-time advocates and activists are not getting paid for this. They're doing it on the side. We would love to just give a little bit of money and a lot of mentorship and wraparound support to the next generation of advocates. And this was, right around the fall of 2020. We wanted to specifically target it to Black LGBTQ activists who were doing work trying to impact our country. And we were able to fund that through 2 individual donors. It's our second year in the program. It's called the Rise Out Activist in Residence Fellowship. It's an awesome program. And it's just the kind of, I give that as another example. It's a little different level of funding. These are funders that were giving $25,000 each to be able to fund this program. But it really, I fight whenever I can the false distinction between your activists or your clients or your, the folks that are using the services at the center are not the people that are advocating. Again, false distinctions. There's a lot of overlap in all of those categories.
Yeah, I mean, amazing. First of all, great. I love that example because we've gotten evidence of kind of what I would call grassroots, like broader, anyone can contribute. Once you're with us, even $5, that's awesome. But that's just a great example that it can also be an amazing major donor engagement tactic. They want ways to get engaged, and this is a really specific, well-timed program that was able to re-engage or engage further existing donors. And I would love to hear, Denise, as you've gone through some of these movements, what is the best way to make sure your advocacy, you're getting the double benefit of the fundraising with your advocacy? Is it this, I know you brought up the storytelling, right? Like having those specific stories from people it's affecting, making sure that's apparent to your donor base. Have you seen anything that works really well in that arena?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I follow the question. In terms of, are you asking how we connect the advocacy to our storytelling, or I'm not sure.
To fundraising? Yeah, I was just asking how you.
Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah, I think that we have done several things, I think, that has made a lot of difference for family equality. We unfortunately, through the tragic loss of one of our major donors, his husband, a freak accident on a trampoline, if you can believe that, died. And because he is so engaged with a variety of people, we were able to set up a fundraiser around that, and we created what's called the Rick Sweezy Memorial Fund, and his husband led the fundraising effort around that, and we were able to fund it with more than $1 million. But we then used that for the sole purpose of storytelling, and so every place that we go, we have some fairly polished stories that we can share online we can share person to person, we can share online, we can share at fundraising events, and we can put on our webpage. So that's one thing that we've done. I think that we created one of our goals was to advance the Every Child Deserves a Family Act in Congress. Now renamed the John Lewis Every Child Deserves a Family Act, because he was the principal sponsor of it. And after his passing, the Congress renamed it to the John Lewis Every Child Deserves a Family Act. And one of our primary goals was to get that piece of legislation passed. And one of the things that we did is we created a pool of foster youth, people who have lived in foster care, and those individuals we trained on how to speak in public. We trained on how to give testimony, and so they would become advocates for us. But that also, as people listen to your story, not only does it move the needle for advancing the legislation, but it also tugs on your heartstrings, and you realize, my God, why aren't we doing more to help these youth? And that very often will help with your fundraising strategies. So I'm not sure that directly got to your question, but
no, I think what I was trying to get at, what you're hitting on, is just that when you're planning your advocacy initiatives, thinking about how it cascades into your fundraising, so you're capturing those stories to make sure that you're getting the double benefit. I think that makes a lot of sense. And one of the things that I know from, I'm sure from all of your experience in this work, is no organization is going about this alone. It's typically you've got multiple nonprofits or agencies that are kind of coming together, and it's very community based. Glenda, what have you learned about collaborating with other stakeholders in a specific legislation push or advocacy push in the past few years of the center's efforts?
That's a really great question. I think one of the biggest lessons we've learned is to be very intentional and conscious of who is leading and who is supporting. And so, GENDA, the Gender Education and Recognition Act, we are not a trans-led organization. We are a New York City and New York State based community center. It was really important to us that there were trans leaders out in front, really pushing this legislation, and that we were supporting in every way that we could. And I think that's sometimes something that gets missed. Sometimes it can wind up being who has the most resources, and that's sort of the group or the person that kind of winds up in front. But I think it's much more effective, and it just works so much better to from start to finish if you can really have the folks that are most impacted leading the charge, and not in a figurehead kind of way, but in a real way. So we tried. I'm not going to say we've always done that well. We've made mistakes, and I think learned from them, and really absolutely try to do that with everything we advocate for going forward. Are we the best spokespeople? Are we the best leader? Am I, or is it someone else? And if it's someone else, it is just as valid and important a position to be in supporting an effort than it is to be leading an effort. I think sometimes when the fundraising pressure is on, I know I feel as an executive director sometimes a pressure to be like, we led this thing, because I want to say it in the best way to the donor. But I think we need to educate our donors, coming back to Emily's first point about education. It doesn't, we want these things to get across the finish line. And so it's not always so important, who led this. It's important that it worked, that it happened. So I would say that's probably the biggest lesson in terms of collaborating, is knowing when to step up and when to step back.
Totally not related to this, but I just have to say, I have a dear friend in the movement. It works with Lambda, as an attorney with Lambda, and he educated me on the child welfare system, on the foster care system, like you can't believe. And every time we would do something together, I'm sitting here with this fundraising hat on, thinking, how do I tell my constituents, my donors, that this is something we did? And he's like, yeah, just tell them, just do it. And he was I never met anybody who was as good about not taking credit. He didn't care. He just really wanted the work done. I've always aspired to do that. I never actually did it very well, but he was my model.
And we just had a really great question come up in the chat. Sorry. Do you think it's possible to cultivate a donor base where maybe everyone doesn't 100% agree politically with everything that you're doing, especially in a really divisive environment? Do you have any examples of seeing that in your own work, or how to think about that? Do you want to exclude donors who maybe aren't 100% on every single thing you're doing, or how do you navigate those trickier situations politically?
Well, A, do I think it's possible to cultivate a donor base that doesn't agree with you 100% politically? Yes, I think that's possible. I think, in fact, it's vital. We are a incredibly diverse country with incredibly diverse experiences, and the divisiveness that we're seeing now is driven by very narrow targeted extremes, and there is so much room for commonality, and oftentimes it's about just defining how that commonality works. Family Equality, for example, is not a reproductive rights organization, but we've always come out full-throated in support of reproductive freedom. And I think that, and we have donors in our database who say, this isn't an LGBTQ issue, you shouldn't be focused on this, but we do anyway. And it's our challenge and our obligation to educate them and bring them along. And you do it with greater and lesser success, but I think it's important, and I think it's possible.
I think also ultimately people have more in common than they don't, and that's something that we don't spend enough time focusing on. People are mostly good, despite how flawed we all are, and there's a lot that unites us. And I think that we've talked a lot today about storytelling, and I think that if you can make storytelling the forefront of your efforts and your mission, that's how you attract donors who perhaps didn't realize that they were as aligned politically as they in fact are.
Completely agree. And I think this is where, just for the nonprofit leaders out there, the social sector leaders, this is where I think the tentpole of values becomes really, really important. As an organization, having clear values that are articulated, that you can link back to, that's what enables us to be like, we have to support reproductive rights and freedom because this is linked. Collaboration and gender justice is one of our values. So I just think that's it can't be everything, but I think that is a place where values as an organization can help you figure out when to speak up, when it might be okay, and this has certainly happened, to offend a donor, because this is who we are and what we truly believe. And if you don't want to come on board for this, then maybe we are not the organization for you. I would say that's mostly not the case. I agree with Emily and Denise that I think we have more in common than we think. And I love the storytelling. That is exactly the way, having those donors meet people that have experienced these things, that have, really lived lives that are different than them, has been the best and sometimes the only way of getting people to really understand outside of themselves why this issue is important.
Yeah, Glenda, I feel like for a place like the center as well, where there's events that bring people in that might not know everything that you do. And so, they might not know that you're all of the positions that you have, and now they're kind of like in your distro and in your community. And I have to imagine part of advocacy is a bit of like general public hearts and minds shifting. And if you're just going to ignore everyone who doesn't already 100% agree with you, like, do you find that there's people evolving their own mindsets because they are now in your own database or in your orbit?
1000%. I 1000%. I would say, and that's something. This isn't unique to the LGBT community, but I think we've been doing that over time a lot. The center has been around for almost 40 years, and there have been moments where, it was the lesbian and gay community center, and there was not inclusion of bisexual and transgender people, and there was resistance to that. I do think that the work we do in the social sector is one of those magical places where people come into contact with folks they might not come into contact with otherwise, and their minds can be changed through human interaction, through storytelling. And I've seen that happen time and time again at the center, whether it's people just coming into the building and sitting on a bench and they wind up talking to each other, or donors coming to our gala dinner, hearing a story of a Latin trans sex worker and her experience with the criminal justice system and addiction, and donors that I thought may have been like, whoa, this is too much, who are like, wow, that was amazing. I'm so glad we're doing that work.
Yeah, I was there. It was really, really powerful. And it was exactly, we brought up a lot of the storytelling. And I love that, getting away from the political, boxes that we put around things. And I think a lot of nonprofit, well, all the examples you've given today have been almost single issue humanizing, movements that you're pointing out to people that make it relatable, and I think help move people out of those boxes, to get to the, like we said, education to activation. And I know it's come up a few times, like the get out the vote component of advocacy. And just before, because we're coming up on time, I just would love, Emily, because you've seen a lot of these initiatives, if you have some practical tips. Get out the vote is something that a lot of different types of organizations could be doing. How do you see it done well that also aligns with an organization's core mission and why they're doing a get out the vote effort?
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately, and you can use Georgia as a great example, get out the vote initiatives don't start today and end with this year's midterms. These are decades long missions that we've seen have tremendous success. Start very small. And I think we've said it so many times, but it does go back to education. And in order to really encourage people who have either voted down the ballot every single time, or someone who's never voted, you have to bring home to them why this is so important. And I think we've seen we all have trauma as it pertains to 2016. We've seen so much change in the last 5-6 years. But I still hear every single day, I voted, I showed up in 2020 and nothing's happened. And that's just categorically untrue. There's so much that has happened. So I think that education piece of inspiring people, especially at the local level, here's what's happened in your neighborhood and here's what could happen if you continue to really bring up these numbers, makes people understand that there's so much more than a vote. And I think giving citizens that level of power to understand I have an impact, not just on what happens on the national stage, but what happens right here at home.
I just noticed your necklace, Emily, as you were saying that. I love it. That's great. And Denise, I'd love to hear from you before we wrap up too, because you mentioned how long haul some of these efforts are. How do you measure success in the interim period, to kind of keep motivated and keep people going, until that legislation's passed? How do you think no, we did a great job this year?
That's really perfect question, because it is so hard. It's so easy to say, pass the Every Child Deserves a Family Act. That's your goal. Well, you didn't do it this year. You didn't do it this year, and that's really not the right answer, right? The right answer is to think about what you can control and figure. I have no vote. I don't have the ability to introduce a piece of legislation because I'm not in Congress. I can't vote to pass it because I'm not in Congress. So passing the legislation can't be one of my measurables because I can't control that. But I can control certain things. I can control what the bill language says. I can control to a point. I mean, obviously you work with a congressional office, right? But as long as you're working with them, I can control what our coalition looks like. I can control how many members. I can control what the reach is. I can control how often we meet. I can control how often we engage with particular congressional people. So break it down into bite-sized pieces. Figure out what are the steps necessary to accomplish a larger goal. And once you know what those steps are, then you take those steps and you break them down into what do I have to do to get that step done? And those become your measurables. And then you can start talking about successes. Hey, we got this bill introduced, or hey, we got this thing. We met with 35 candidates or 35 legislators with 350 advocates when we had our lobby day. That becomes a huge victory, even though, did you pass the bill? No, but you're making the important steps necessary to do it. So I think that's how you measure success. At least that was how we did it. And it works both from a management of the project perspective, as well as from a fundraising and advocacy perspective.
Awesome. Yeah, great advice. And one thing that we still haven't touched on, Glenda, that I'd love to wrap up here with is, like, we've talked a lot about the technology and the strategies. We haven't really talked about there's people behind this that are having to do all of it, right? You have your staff have to be doing this. And I know when you are pushing for change, you meet resistance and you see things happening in the news that are really devastating. Like, when you have a team that is so close to these issues that are being flamed, right, at a national level and politicized, and how do you, like, take care of people doing that? Like, how do you keep them motivated and kind of mentally healthy to engage in the change that you're trying to make?
Oh, I thought I was glad that Denise got the last question, because I thought that was a hard question, and then I heard this question. It's not easy. It's hard. I would say that doing LGBT work, it's primarily LGBTQ folks here and our allies who are personally and deeply impacted by everything that's going on and everything they're pushing for. And to encounter that resistance and that sometimes vitriol and hatred is really taxing. And so I think the first thing we do is acknowledge it, is just make it very normalized. Like, this is something you're going to encounter, whether you're counseling someone one-on-one or you're speaking at a rally or, whatever the various form is. Just acknowledge that it does happen, and then form a support system. And primarily for us, that's like the team here, the folks that you work with at the center understand what that is like to be in that room or to be on that stage, and can support that in a community level. And then I think it comes down to self-care and trying to create a professional work environment where people have time and the space to be able to take care of themselves, and really normalizing that as well. And we try and do that in a way that acknowledges the oppression that exists in our country, and how that impacts people differently. So, it's an excellent question, and I think we dismiss it at our peril. Nobody can last in this movement if we aren't seriously thinking about and talking about this. We are all human beings, and it's challenging.
No.
Hence the reason I'm retired. Well, that and being in my late 60s.
Well, your role model, Denise, someday. Looking forward to that.
That's awesome. Well, thank you. Emily, I'd love to give you kind of a last word here. Just if someone is contemplating, like, really investing in their advocacy strategy, what would your, like, words of motivation be before we wrap up here for the hour?
Sure. I mean, obviously, I would say you can do it. Like you need to start where you're at. I think is the most valuable piece of advice that I have. Trying to skip forward to a multi-pronged advocacy approach is setting yourself up for failure. And I think by starting with your existing, base, whether that's donors, whether that's volunteers, implementing tools, obviously, every action mobilized that can help you to increase those initiatives, but start where you're at.
Awesome. Great advice. And thank you so much for the panelists today. So many amazing insights. I really love this conversation. Reminder to our audience that this is brought to you by Pond. If you fill out a quick survey on the session, we'll also give you some credit for giving us feedback. We want to keep improving and doing better with these conversations. And if you need tools and resources for your advocacy efforts, bring them to Pond. It's the place where you can find solutions to those things, just like Emily mentioned. So thank you so much for the time, everybody. This was wonderful.
Thank you, Mitch.